Our topic this evening is the context and background of the First Crusade. Not necessarily so much the First Crusade itself, but why is there a crusade? Why did crusades begin with this event? And so we'll just start with the culmination of that crusade. This is a map of the medieval city of Jerusalem in 1099. You can kind of see it. It's a little, you might be watching on a small device, but you can see it divided into 4 different colors, 4 different quarters that are beginning clockwise: Muslim, Jewish, Armenian, and Christian quarters. And you can also see in orange across the north wall the large armies of the Crusaders, the Crusader leaders: Robert of Flanders, Robert of Normandy, Tancred of Normandy, and Godfrey of Bouillon. And then at the south side, another army, the army of Raymond of Saint-Gilles, who is the Count of Toulouse, one of the great lords of the southern France, besieging the city. So for a month and a half, between June 7th and June 15th, a force of perhaps 13,000 soldiers from Western Europe besieged the city of Jerusalem, which was perhaps garrisoned by some 3,000 or so Muslim soldiers who had been garrisoning the city there, brought from Fatimid Egypt. So at this point in the story, the Egyptians have reassumed control of the city and are defending it against the Crusaders. They also have sent an army en route in order to relieve the city from the Crusaders. But meanwhile, the attackers built 2 very impressive siege towers. Not easy to do because the locals had chopped down any kind of close by trees, and it's already not the most wooded of places, but a force of Genoese had come with a bunch of wood, and so they were able to actually make state-of-the-art siege equipment, which they used to bring up against the north wall, and you can kind of see that. And meanwhile, the attackers on the south successfully stormed the gate. So here's an image, an artist's rendition, and you can see a siege tower here against the north wall, pushed up against the wall as the defenders, the garrison, are inside, and the Crusaders are also using ladders in order to scale the walls and to breach the wall and get into the city. Here's a close-up of that. So the northern armies, Tancred of Normandy and Godfrey of Bouillon, coming through the 2 places where they breach the wall with the towers, enter into the city, and immediately begin chasing everybody, both the garrison, but also civilians, and whom they also begin to slaughter. Likewise, when that's happening, Raymond of Toulouse is able to storm the southern gate and cut off any retreat by the garrison. So the invaders massacre everyone inside the city, so all of the inhabitants, everyone who had taken refuge in the city, the garrison. The contemporary accounts put the figure at 70,000 killed, but as we probably know from all of the lectures we've done, whenever there's an ancient or a medieval source and they're talking about numbers, they always exaggerate. They aren't good at, frankly, counting. That's a difficult thing. Things are not well accounted for in these kind of time periods, and even a contemporary on the Crusader side said really only God knows how many people there were killed because so many were killed. May have been as many as 40,000 people, 30 or 40,000 people were perhaps in the city. Up to a lot. So all of the Muslim and then also Jewish inhabitants that had been there. Some were spared for ransom purposes and that kind of a thing, but there's a small number. This is not totally unusual. So in antiquity and throughout the Middle Ages, the rule essentially of war was if a city capitulates to an invader, and just says, okay, we'll surrender, then the invaders give terms, and you're supposed to honor those terms. So maybe the inhabitants of the city will pay you off. Maybe they will let you in the city and even take the city, but they're allowed to leave, or pay you off and leave. Or maybe they let you, you're allowed to loot the city for 3 days, but then you have to stop. Something like that. There would be terms if you give in. If you tell the besiegers, though, no way, we're not going to ever give in. We're going to fight you to the end, and then they get in and take the city. Then the rule of law or war, essentially the custom in antiquity, in the Middle Ages, it was you can kill everybody and take everything, and that's what happened in this case. So, a contemporary, Raymond of Aguilera, gives this eyewitness account in his chronicle. He says, in all the streets and squares of the city, Jerusalem, mounds of hands and heads and feet were seen. People were walking quite openly over dead men and horses. But I have yet to describe only the minor horrors. If I described what I actually saw, you would not believe me. So there's just too much carnage. There's too many blood flowing in the streets for him to describe it all. But he thinks, what an apt punishment. The very place that had endured for so long blasphemies against God was now masked in the blood of the blasphemers. Once the city had been captured, it was most rewarding to see the devotion of the pilgrims before the Holy Sepulchre, how they clapped in exultation, singing a new song to the Lord. So it's a horrible carnage, which the Crusader chronicler here fully approves of. So, having captured the city, the Crusaders founded a kingdom there, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which would last another couple centuries until 1291, when it was finally eradicated by a Muslim reconquest. So Raymond of Toulouse, Raymond Sanchis, this important lord from southern France, probably the most important leader of the crusade, refused the honor of being king of Jerusalem, but after that choice, Godfrey of Bouillon became the first leader of the kingdom. He refused the title King of Jerusalem because he said that Jerusalem could only have one king, which is Christ, but his successors quickly forgot that pretense and just went ahead and took the title king, King of Jerusalem. So to get to this very moment where they found their kingdom here and control this, now emptied of people city of Jerusalem, Godfrey and his knights had marched over 2,000 miles or 3,200 kilometers from northern France. So that's kind of what we want to talk about is how did we get to this point? How did this happen? Were they even able to do that? Also, why did they do that? What is the context of the First Crusade? So all of this is conflict between what we call the Abrahamic religions. So Islam, Christianity, Judaism, which all in their roots go back to First Temple Judaism, which is this time period before the Babylonians destroy Solomon's temple and Jerusalem and take the people from Judah into exile into Babylon, when the origins of the first texts of the Bible are written. So First Temple Judaism gives birth to Second Temple Judaism. When the exiles return, they refound Jerusalem, they build a new temple, they create a new, not a kingdom anymore, now they're just the leaders of a small poor province of the Persian Empire, but some of those returning leaders like Ezra who have been Persian officials, are also charged with compiling the text of the law, and may well be the final editor that puts the first 5 books of the Bible, the Jewish Torah, the Pentateuch, or 5 books of Moses, into their present order and condition, edits them together so that they're the way we have them now. So we'll also mention here in terms of influences, as I say, Ezra is an official of the Persian Empire. He refounds Jerusalem and the temple at the order or with the permission of the Persian emperor. The Persian Empire also has a very important and early world religion that it doesn't force on people, but that is very influential, the religion of Zoroastrianism, one of the very earliest world religions. It's a dualistic world religion, but it has concepts like heaven and hell, resurrection, a cosmic devil, and the concept of a Messiah, apocalypse, and a new world. So all of those ideas which had not been present in First Temple Judaism, which are present in Zoroastrianism, those come into importance in Second Temple Judaism, may or may not be because of Zoroastrian influence, but certainly those are all ideas in Zoroastrianism, which is much bigger and more important religion influencing Second Temple Judaism. So there is also another heir of First Temple Judaism, the Samaritans, the people who had been left behind, especially specifically in the northern kingdom of Israel, who had their own temple there on Mount Gerizim in Samaria, and they now form a second major strand of the religion, an heir to First Temple Judaism that is not aligned with Second Temple Judaism. They're refused by by Ezra and his followers. They offer to help rebuild the Jerusalem temple. They are not allowed to participate because Ezra states that they're disqualified. He thinks that they've intermarried with locals and that means they can no longer be considered true Israelites. And so they become rivals. Second Temple Judaism, after the destruction by the Romans of the Second Temple, of Herod's temple, we've had in the Roman Jewish wars, we've had several lectures on these wars. When Jews regroup, they regroup under the rabbis, under the teachers, and create Rabbinic Judaism, which, like Samaritanism, continues to this day. But of course, another sect of Judaism, of Second Temple Judaism, that emerges at the end of the Second Temple period is Christianity, the different forms of early Christianity, which are influenced in no small part because of Paul converting a whole bunch of Greek pagans to Christianity, is influenced by Greek paganism and especially Greek philosophical ideas, which had already been influencing Second Temple Judaism in general in the Second Temple period. So early Christianities give way ultimately to Roman Christianity, the state religion of the Roman Empire, when Constantine converts, and a couple generations later it becomes the state religion. And as time goes on, there is a split between the Roman Empire, and that ultimately results in a split between Christianity from the Eastern Greek Christianity centered on Constantinople and Western Latin Christianity centered on Rome, both of which continue to this day, as does Rabbinic Judaism and the Samaritans. Meanwhile, though, there had been other early Christianities, including those Christians like Jesus' brother James and his community, who continued to practice Mosaic law, to continue to keep kosher, and may have had different ideas about Jesus as a Messiah and so on. When that idea within Christianity became seen as a heresy by the Roman state religion of Christianity. Many of those Christians moved outside the boundaries of the empire into the east, both into the Persian Empire, but also south into Arabia. And it's there that group of Christians had influence on a young prophet, Muhammad. And while it's not a direct successor, this is part of the origins then for early Islam, which after Muhammad's death, as people were trying to decide who should be his successor, his caliph, we got two branches, the Sunnis and the Shiites. The Sunnis, who considered that Muhammad's companions should be the caliphs, the Shiites, who consider that Muhammad's family should lead the body of Muslims. And so that gives a very, very simplified overview of the Abrahamic religions. And I wanted to spell it out. I mean, we're leaving a lot of different people off of this and groups off of this. And so this is, like I say, very simplified. But I wanted to kind of bring that family chart together because this is a war between related religions. And in part, that's because that happens, I think, because you end up disagreeing most with the people that you're closest to. The more absolutely alien people are, yes, maybe it's harder to understand what you're even fighting over. You don't agree with them, you don't like what they're doing, but it's people who are the closest to you that you end up being most upset about. And also because you're contesting a lot of things. So for example, all of these groups, have a different vision of what it means to be a chosen community, what the inheritance from Abraham is. What are the Old Testament, or what even calling it Old Testament is contested, right? So that's what Christians call the Hebrew Bible. What is its meaning? And likewise, all of the groups have different visions and understandings of, for example, who Jesus of Nazareth is. Whether he's for Jews, a renegade rabbi who is misunderstood by his followers, or a very important prophet, but certainly not the Son of God, and certainly not God for Muslims, or the Son of God, who is in fact God, although not the same as God the Father or God the Holy Spirit from the Christian perspective. So all of these things are contested, as for example is the city of Jerusalem, which is holy to all three of these Abrahamic religions, not to the Samaritans. So they're the one group that doesn't care about Jerusalem since they have their own temple in Samaria. So let's look at Jerusalem. So as of the time of Jesus, under King Herod, prior to the Roman-Jewish Wars, Jerusalem was part of Judea, which had been a client kingdom ruled by the Herodians, King Herod and his successors, although again, under the really calling the shots is the Roman Senate and later the emperors. And so at different times, the Roman Empire cut Herod's realm up and allowed different ones of his heirs to be a partial ruler over parts of it. And at other times, they just decided that this would become incorporated as a province and they'd rule it directly. Nevertheless, during Herod the Great's time, Herod was a very rich ruler and was also an incredible builder, one of the, changed the face of the province much more substantially than anybody before him. And part of his construction was the massive platform of the temple precinct, which you can kind of see dominating Roman era Jerusalem here in the kind of upper right-hand corner of the city. So we've had whole lectures on the Roman-Jewish wars. As we mentioned, the Romans destroyed the Jerusalem temple in the year 70 during the first Roman-Jewish war, and after the second, actually the third Roman-Jewish war in 132 to 136, the Emperor Hadrian decided, that's it, we're getting rid of Judea, we're going to wipe it out of the map, we're not going to have a province of Judea anymore, we're going to have a province now of Palestina. And after Jerusalem, which has continued to be destroyed, we're now going to rebuild that. We are going to refound it as a pagan city. And he names it after himself. So in the same tradition that, Alexandria is named after Alexander, and Caesarea is named after Caesar, and Ptolemaeus and all the others are named after these kind of Greek Greek Hellenistic kings. The new city here is going to be called Aelia Capitolina. So one of Hadrian's names is Aelius. So Publius Aelius Hadrianus Augustus. Now the city will be called Aelia. And so he decides to refound it. We have a 6th century mosaic map from Medaba that kind of shows what Aelia would have looked like after it had been rebuilt by Hadrian, and you can kind of see in this mosaic a street that is right at the center. It's like a circle, and then in the middle of it is the street, and lining the street are little columns you can kind of see. And so that is, the map is on its side if you're thinking of north and south, so north is to the left. And so that would be the Cardo Maximus, as the Romans call the main street of a Roman city. So there's usually a crossroads of street, and this is the north-south street that begins at a column and goes down into the city. And you can kind of see what an artist's reconstruction of what Aelia would have looked like. You can kind of see the Roman Cardo Maximus as the main north-south street that's going from the Damascus Gate down to the camp of the Roman Legion. And the walls have been removed, and the city walls are destroyed largely. And on top of the Temple Mount is probably a new temple that Hadrian has put there, probably a temple to Jupiter. We don't know for sure if it was Jupiter, most likely though. And so in fact, actually, because the ancient city had been pretty much destroyed, the remnants here, what remains are of pre-Aelia is essentially Herod's. There's some underground works and cisterns and things like that, but it's Herod's Temple Mount structure, vast Temple Mount structure that continues. And then otherwise, though, most of what we think of as the old city is actually not the ancient pre-Aelia city, but it's still on the pattern of the refounded Aelia Capitolina, the Roman pagan city. So this destruction of Jerusalem and refounding of it as a pagan city had a big impact on Judaism and Christianity both. So with the elimination of the temple that had been controlled by the priests, by the Sadducees, Judaism, which is now entirely practiced again in the diaspora in ancient times here. Everybody's, in other words, in diaspora. They're exiled. They're no longer in control of Jerusalem and living there. That caused a refocus. So it can't be led anymore by the temple priesthood and the Sadducees. Now, instead, leadership passes to the rabbis, the teachers of Torah, and Judaism is refounded as rabbinic Judaism, and it comes to be much more closely resembling the Judaism that we now know today than what would have existed before the destruction of the temple. Similarly, there's a big impact on the Christians, because that Jewish Christian community, I mentioned James, the brother of Jesus' church, had a lot of authority because it was there in the holy city itself. It had the authority of the family of Jesus. Now, the leadership of that church flees to a city called Pella, and it is no longer, therefore, having the authority of being from Jerusalem. And essentially, over time, that authority evaporates as Christianity's main line largely then evolves out of those Greek-speaking churches, including the ones planted by Paul. And we're going to have a whole lecture about that, but essentially, Paul's churches were able to grow much faster because it turns out if you don't make adult converts get circumcised and have to have special dietary rules where you're not allowed to have meals essentially with your friends who are not part of the community, that's a big barrier to entry to convert. Whereas if you don't have to do any of that, it's much more appealing for pagans to convert to your religion. So as we fast forward, the sea change for Christianity comes with the conversion of the Emperor Constantine. So his mother, St. Helena, who is also a Christian, the fact that the imperial family patronizes Christianity transforms it from a scattered minority group within the Roman Empire into an imperial institution, and a few generations later, it ultimately becomes the state religion of the Roman Empire. So St. Helena ends up being essentially a prototype or a pioneer of the later tradition of Christian pilgrimage. So Helena made a pilgrimage to the province of Palestine, not that big a deal since it's been part of the Roman Empire this entire time. She goes to the city of Aelia, and locals all around there are only too happy to help her identify all sorts of traditional spots associated with biblical stories. So, whether or not there was any actual historical memory after centuries that, this is where, Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist, or this is where, Pilate held his trial of Jesus, or any other number of events that are in the Bible, whether or not there was any, actual historical memory of the real place is questionable. But in any event, locals were only too happy to identify spots when the mother of the emperor was there with a huge retinue and incredible amounts of money in order to buy property and sites, in order to create places for churches and shrines, and in order to find relics. So anything that dates back to the time. And the most important relics that St. Helena uncovers while she's in Aelia, while she's in Jerusalem here, is the relics of the true cross. So the idea is that she finds the crosses that were used when Jesus is crucified, including the cross that he is crucified on, according to her belief and according to tradition. It's amazing. I think there's no possibility that this was actually a true artifact, but it was believed as such for thereafter until up to the present. Later, as relics proliferate in the Middle Ages, people would have different splinters supposedly from the true cross, and some observers commented wryly that if all of the splinters and other pieces of the true cross were in medieval Europe were brought together, there would be enough wood to build Noah's Ark. So there was a desire to have that, and so this was fulfilled by St. Helena. So her example helped establish pilgrimage as a core Christian spiritual practice. So that continued throughout late antiquity and the Middle Ages, and it continues all the way to the present. There are lots of Christians who go on pilgrimages to all sorts of places, but including making their way to Jerusalem I know lots of people in my church who've gone to Jerusalem. My dad went to Jerusalem, all kinds of people. And that was true even during the many centuries when the city was ruled by Muslims and when voyages, like in the Middle Ages and the Dark Ages, were very, very perilous. And so, for example, a guy named Richard, he's called now Richard the Pilgrim, but Richard of Wessex, he took his whole family from the medieval, English kingdom of Wessex on a pilgrimage from England all the way to Jerusalem. He died on the way, but at least one of his sons made it there and back. And so it was, an amazing thing that when you think of how little your average person in the Middle Ages would have ever traveled, where a peasant might be born in a village and hardly go more than 1 or 2 villages away at any time in their entire life and die in the same village that they started in, that sometimes some people were making what would have been just enormous journeys all the way across what was then the known world for them. Ultimately, this Christian practice of pilgrimage in the West becomes the precursor, and is the origin really of our modern custom of tourism. One of the reasons that Christians were motivated sometimes to go on pilgrimage, sometimes they wanted to go just to be with a place, so that you wanted to go near saints so that you could, where their resting place is, so that you could pray with their behalf, to intercede on your behalf. But there was also a sense that this was a way to have an expiation for sins. So if you had done something for which you'd become essentially an outcast from society, the way you could potentially renew your reputation and come back as a person who could be forgiven maybe by your society was to make this dramatic break from your daily life and go on a pilgrimage, the further really the better, and have that renew your life. And so an example of this is Count Fulk III, Fulk the Black, Fulk Nera, in the end of the 10th, the beginning of the 11th century. He was the Count of Anjou in France. So Anjou is, one of the powerful, semi-independent, autonomous little states that were existing in central medieval French. Fulk is an ancestor of the Plantagenets, who become the Royal House of England. Anyway, he undertook an unprecedented 4 pilgrimages to Jerusalem in the course of his life while he was Count of Anjou. He was a really fierce warrior. In one of the battles that he fought against a local rival, he massacred a whole group of people who had taken refuge in a church. And as a result of that, he must have felt, apparently anyway, the weight of that as a sin. And so he undertook his first pilgrimage all the way from France to Jerusalem to atone for that, and then to bring himself back into Christian society. So if we go back to Constantine now, so we're going to jump back and forth a little bit here to establish all this context. So Constantine, the emperor who converted, was a great patron of Christianity. He is also a great builder, like Herod the Great before him, but on a much bigger scale now because he's the Roman emperor. Constantine constructed many, many churches, including, for example, Old St. Peter's in Rome. This is the basilica that was built in the year 360 completed in the year 360 on the Vatican Hill just outside of Rome, on the site where Peter the apostle was traditionally thought to have been martyred. He also, of course, founded Constantinople as a new Christian Rome, and he built many of the original churches that were there. In Jerusalem, Constantine commissions the original Church of the Holy Sepulchre on a site of Christ's tomb that was identified by his mother, by St. Helena. So if we look at kind of a layout of that original church, it was right in the heart of Aelia, of Jerusalem, the Roman city of Aelia. So the original site would include a basilica, which you can kind of see on the right, that leads to where the main street of the north-south street of the city is. And let's see if this works. If I can. No, it doesn't. I was thinking if I could do a highlight of this. But you can see in the basement, kind of under the basilica part, which is the part on the long church part on the right, that there's stairs leading down, and that leads down to this underground place, which is where St. Helena, the empress, found those crosses, the true cross. At the top of the stairs in the courtyard here, you can see there's a circle, and that circle is around a rock. So that outcropping of rock is understood to be the hill of Golgotha, the hill of Calvary. So the idea is that that is the spot where Jesus was crucified. And then in the domed part that you can kind of see on the left, the shrine, there is a little kind of hut, and that's the idea in there is the tomb where Jesus is buried. So these are all traditional identifications. I don't think that it's particularly likely that any of these are the actual historical places. They're definitely nicely located, those, in order to build a composite shrine. I mean, the place where the crosses are found are probably correct. Whether the site of the crucifixion or especially the tomb are probably, anyway, we can say that they're traditional sites, and they have become made holy because of they have been viewed as this since the year 325 when this was built. By the time we get to the middle of the Middle Ages, the church's configuration changed a lot. So the Fatimid Caliph, Al-Hakim of Egypt, who was ruling over Jerusalem in the middle of the 11th century, he ordered that he was trying to get rid of a lot of Christian sites in Palestine, and so he ordered the destruction of Constantine's church in the year 1009. And so that obviously caused a huge uproar all across Christendom, especially considering there had been a great rise in the number of Christian pilgrims who were still making their way, as far away as Scandinavia or England or France and so on, to go visit Jerusalem in increasing numbers, including Fulknera, who we talked about, who went there 4 times. And so that caused a huge uproar and upset, and so Al-Hakim's son and successor, Az-Zahir, the new Fatimid Caliph of Egypt, he agreed to let the Byzantine emperors finance a reconstruction, and so the new church doesn't have that basilica part anymore. Now there is a cloister over the subterranean chapel of St. Helena where she finds the true cross. There's a new kind of conical dome that is built over the tomb. The original tomb was destroyed, and so this is a replica now. And there's now an additional shrine and dome built over the little part of Golgotha, the rock, where Jesus is traditionally crucified. So that's the church as would have been found when the Crusaders got there. It's different even today if you were to go visit it, although it's more similar to that. So it continued to be modified over the centuries. There was a fire that caused the medieval rotunda dome over the tomb to collapse in 1808, and so there's now the dome that's there is a replacement that's been constructed there, and you can see what the floor plan kind of looks like in this cross section if you were to go visit it now. So this is a picture, and the 2 domes that are in the foreground, the gray domes, are the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and you can see in the background the Temple Mount with the Muslim shrine, the Dome of the Rock, on it very prominently in the background. So that site, which is really a major site, that temple site, that big pedestal built by Herod the Great, during all of the centuries after Constantine's conversion, while Christian Romans have control over Aelia, over Jerusalem, they left the temple site vacant. There might have been a temple to Jupiter that had been built there, but that was probably allowed to decay into ruins. And this is probably because the Christians wanted to say, look, this is done in fulfillment of a prophecy that Jesus makes in the Gospel of Mark that, quote, about concerning this temple with all of its magnificent buildings, not one stone here would be left on another, every one will be thrown down. So the shrine for the Christians is not that the temple being ruined was in fact was important theologically for the Christian pilgrims, who are instead focused on the Holy Sepulchre and the tomb, and with its tomb, as well as Golgotha, Calvary, and the place where the true cross was found, in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So when the forces of Islam conquer Aelia, which they call Ilia in Arabic, sometimes now also called Al-Quds, the Holy, at Ilia, when they conquered the city in 635 from the East Roman Empire, the vacant temple podium became the site of an important Muslim mosque, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which you can see on the left. And it's also the location of a shrine, the Dome of the Rock, built over a rock that's underneath there, which is said to be, traditionally anyway, the mountain where Abraham was going to offer his sacrifice. The temple, probably the traditional location anyway, of where Solomon's temple and Herod's temple, the center part of the temple, would be. The entire area is called the Noble Sanctuary by Muslims, the Haram es-Sharif. So this conquest occurs at the end of what we would call late antiquity and the beginning of the Middle Ages. Always with periodization, you kind of have to decide when does the ancient times end, when does medieval times begin. This is one of the places where historians like to cite that change. So the provinces, as we can kind of see here, this is a map covering kind of the early 7th century, the years 606 to 630. So the East Roman Empire here in purple, kind of centered on Anatolia and Greece, had long had and continued to have control over Syria and Egypt, and their great ancient rival continued to be the Persian Empire, now the empire of the Sassanid Persians. During a period of East Roman instability, the Persians were able to successfully conquer Syria and Egypt, which much diminished, obviously, the East Roman Empire. And part of the issue was that both the Syrians and the Egyptians, while they were Christians, they were out of alignment with Constantinople. And so the patriarchs of Antioch and Jerusalem and Alexandria were disputing with the patriarch of Constantinople this question that we've covered, this Christological controversy: how many natures does Christ have? And so the Orthodox, the Greek and actually Roman position is that Christ has one nature that is fully human and fully divine, whereas the position that was popular in Alexandria and Antioch is the idea that no, there's two natures. Christ has a divine nature and a human nature, and that seems very abstract and obtuse at this point for a thing to go to war over and to persecute each other. But like I said at the beginning of this, you're mostly you dislike people who are the most like you, and so you get into quibbles over things that are you're very close with. And so this is one of the reasons why Egypt and Syria put up a little less resistance maybe to the Persians. But a really important or strong emperor, Heraclius, recovered a lot of imperial power. He kind of reformed the empire. He is causing a transition to the empire. This is one of the reasons why historians now are going to stop calling the East Roman Empire the Roman Empire anymore, even though it continues to be self-identified as the Romans, as the Roman Empire, and instead introduce a modern term, the Byzantine Empire, because, for example, he dispenses with much use of Latin anymore. They've lost control of most Latin-speaking places. They're really a Greek empire at this point. And he also, for example, he's lost Egypt, and so therefore he's lost the grain supply, so he eliminates the grain dole that had been this huge tradition going all the way back to the Roman Republic. He reorganizes the empire in a lot of ways on a new level. He takes the Greek title Basileus, which is again part of a focus now on this kind of Greek East, which is where they are. So with all that restructuring, with getting all of the treasures out of all the churches, with exhausting the remnants of the empire as much as possible, he is able to retake Syria and Egypt, and he marches into Persia and Mesopotamia and starts really throttling the Sassanid Empire, the Persian Empire. They ultimately make peace, but both of them are wiped out. So both empires are at their weakest that they've been after this vast fighting that they've had for a generation. And so that comes at a very bad moment for them. So facing these depleted empires, the armies of Islam, the Muslim Arabs, were able to join with mercenary Bedouin Arab tribes that are on the borders of both the Roman and Persian empires. Heraclius, because he's out of money, he had stopped paying these mercenaries who had normally been people defending the frontier from, for the Bedouins. Now, a lot of those guys switch sides and attack the empire. So the Persian Empire, that was smaller and weaker, is overrun entirely, so it collapses and is conquered. The Romans, the Byzantines once again lose Egypt and Syria, but they're able to hold out because of the incredible position of their capital, Constantinople. Nevertheless, there's very little resistance. They lose their province. The Byzantine province of North Africa, Carthage, falls to Islam, and also the Visigothic kingdom of Spain does. And so it just sweeps across and establishes the Umayyad Caliphate, the early Islamic state here that stretches then from Spain and North Africa all the way across to India. So the energy of that caliphate, as strong as it was, broke against the formidable walls of Constantinople. Constantinople was a genius location. Constantine put that there. It's at the strait that connects the Black and Aegean Seas, and it's also at the Narrows that is where you're connecting Asia and Europe. It's on a peninsula, and it's able to have these vast walls that were essentially unassailable until the invention of modern cannon. And so it's on both sides essentially of these two land masses and also water. You have to have an amazing navy, and you have to have two big armies sit outside of this thing until they starve to death in order to actually take the city. And despite the power and ability of the Arab Caliphate, they are never able to get that to happen. And so that allowed the remains of the Roman state to hold out long, long after all the other ancient empires were history. And so Constantinople only, in fact, falls to later, much later than this, to Crusaders. And then when that happens, the Byzantine state is pretty much destroyed, although it has a revival and ekes out another couple centuries of existence. But it's really only with the essentially the Christian backstab to it that causes the ultimate fall of it. So from a very low point indeed, the Byzantines are able to regroup. Anatolia remains now their main heartland. It was subject to continual attacks in the south, especially from the Arab Caliphate. But it turns out that Anatolia, its climate, its terrain, and so forth, were less suited to Arab Bedouins than, for example, North Africa, which they ran across, and even into Spain. And so that prevented, it allowed the Byzantines to hold on to Anatolia, the Asia Minor Peninsula, and they were able to do that even while they lost most of the rest of their heartland to invaders. So Germanic invaders, the Lombards, took most of Italy, and Slavic invaders who were allies of the Avar Khanate, that's up in Hungary, the Slavs and the Bulgars took most of the Balkans. And so really the Byzantines were left with the capital, a bunch of different islands and outposts and things like that, and then especially their heartland, Anatolia. Eventually, though, from that base, they were able to push back the different Slavs and Bulgars and retake what we now think of kind of as Greece, and that becomes kind of a second heartland on either side then of Constantinople. So much reduced from what the whole Roman Empire had been. If you think of the Roman Empire all around the entire Mediterranean, had been a Roman pond. Now it's become much more of an Arab pond, of which the Byzantines are clinging to. This time period also corresponds to a real dark age. So a lot of times people think of the whole Middle Ages as the Dark Ages, which is not fair. There is an early part of it, especially in the West, which are pretty dark, where the Roman state collapsed. And when that happened, later historians, especially in the Renaissance, called that period the Dark Ages. Essentially, Germanic barbarians replaced the state and also the military, and so we end up with kingdoms like the kingdoms of the Visigoths, the Vandals, the Suevi, the Burgundians, the Ostrogoths, and the Franks, and so forth. So in the face of Muslim invasion, the Visigothic kingdom of Spain collapsed immediately. The king met the invaders in battle and was killed, and that caused the collapse of the kingdom. That's one of the one of the notes and takeaway notes to late antique and early medieval kings. It's like King Harold of England, the Anglo-Saxons. If you don't go meet William of Normandy in battle at Hastings, if you just let him rampage around, and while you stay locked up in your castle, and eventually he has to get tired and go home, you look weak in a way, but you don't get killed, and he doesn't become William the Conqueror. Same thing if you don't go into the forefront and rush and meet Tariq and his Muslim expeditionary force that have crossed into Spain. If you instead let them rampage around a little bit, and then they eventually have to go back to North Africa, and you don't get killed, then they don't necessarily conquer your whole territory the way they do if they get to kill the king and cause a major disruption to to a kingdom, which is always at its weakest during a succession moment. So having lost Spain to the Muslims, additional raiders crossed the Pyrenees and tried to take Gaul, what's now France. But the kingdom of the Franks in the beginning of the 8th century is able to repel these further armies and expeditionary forces, led, this is their kingdom here, the kings are the Merovingians, who've become very weak and essentially powerless, but they have strong royal officials, they're mayors of the palace, they're major domos, as they were called, of the family of the Carolingians. And so Charles Martel, Charles the Hammer, is able to lead a defense, and that prevents a further loss of, to Islam. So although we sometimes think of like there was a collapse of civilization is happening when the Roman Empire in the West falls, and there may be a total loss of technology or something like that. Some capacities are lost when the state collapses. So like I say, barbarian mercenaries, these Germanic confederations replaced both the Roman army and then also the state, at least at the kind of national level. The local level, the city level, would have still been led by local Roman officials, and especially the church, which becomes the remnants of what had been the Roman state. That, of course, led to a massive decline in the state's capacity to do things that the Romans did: build monumental public works, build roads, maintain roads, build aqueducts, all of the other projects. So some technology is lost, so the Roman formula for making concrete, some of the more complex mass engineering projects. It was also, though, accompanied by a significant decline in population that had already been well underway in the empire in late antiquity. That continues, and so that means there's way less capacity to do anything in the West. Nevertheless, a lot of technology, this is not like a collapse back to, where would they lose literacy or something like that, or to go to a much more primitive state. And certainly even military technology continues continues to improve because fighting continues. And even other things like agricultural techniques, labor-saving devices are retained and even improved. The Roman state had the capacity, it was a slave society, and had the capacity to marshal huge numbers of slaves to do public works. Now, as the population gets so much smaller, you can't just throw all of these people at any problem. And so now you suddenly are forced to create labor-saving devices, things like windmills and things that are kind of actually the origin for the modern Western society, which is so focused on kind of technology. That was less true in the Roman Empire. So that grows out of the so-called Dark Ages. The Umayyads, let's see, missed the slide here. So anyway, I'll see. So at the same time that the West is in a dark age, the Islam is in its golden age. So the first dynasty of the caliphs, the Umayyads, were headquartered in Damascus, in Syria, near the border with the Byzantines, because for a long time they were focused on trying to take Constantinople. Their focus is on defeating the Byzantines. When that played out, and they were also replaced by a new dynasty, the Abbasids, in 750, the new dynasty decided to change its focus. It moved the capital from Syria to Mesopotamia, to Iraq. They built and founded a new city, Baghdad, not very far away from where ancient Babylon had been. There's a idea of the original, which is this planned circular city or round city at the center of it. again, the focus now has got to be changed. When your empire does that, you're no longer as concentrated on the west. You're now focusing in on the east and the possibilities of taking, Central Asia and India and so on. So from the height of their power, however, in the 8th century, where they also did such things as sponsoring a translation project where all of Greek philosophy is translated into Arabic, which causes a philosophical revolution within Islam. The power, though, of the Abbasid caliphs quickly declined. From their heights, they lost control of their vast empire. This empire stretched, like I say, from North Africa across to India, as local rulers at the fringes gained autonomy and then independence, beginning in Spain, where the last Umayyad actually fled and established a new independent emirate, later Caliphate of Spain, of Andalusia. And then locally, autonomy spread across North Africa to Egypt, and similarly in Transoxiana, in Central Asia, and Iran, and then ultimately even Iraq itself, Baghdad itself. The caliphs ultimately in their own area, while they continued to be in charge of ceremony and so on, a court, they became figureheads under the control of emirs from the Buyid dynasty, an Iranian dynasty that took control of Iran and Iraq from the caliphs. Something that also happened at this time is when the Muslims conquered Transoxiana, so when they started to take over Central Asia, to where all the stands are, they came into contact with nomadic people, the Turks, who were also fierce warriors. They began to convert to Islam, and they also began to serve as mercenaries of the caliphate. And so sometimes they were also ones that were achieving power and authority even in kind of the central lands. But by the time we get to the 11th century, Seljuk Turks took control of the easternmost province of the caliphate for themselves, and they later expanded their empire, taking Persia and Baghdad itself, and ultimately eliminating the Buyid dynasty that had taken control of the caliphs, and now they take control of the caliphs. The Seljuk Beys, that's the Turkish name for prince, chieftain, later prince, bey, they assume now the title Sultan, which means the person who has the authority. So it means authority. So the caliph is still a symbolic leader, but all of the authority is delegated and vested in the sultan who is in charge of the empire. And so ultimately the Seljuk Empire then takes over the heartland from Syria across to Transoxiana, Iran, and Iraq of the old caliphate. So the rise of this Turkish empire proved to be an especially devastating threat to the Byzantines. It's also regretted by Arabs who want to have Arab rule over them, or Persians who want to have Persian rule over their heartland. But nevertheless, at least those are all of the same religion. Unfortunately for the Byzantines, the Turks were a special threat. So as we mentioned, the climate zone, the terrain that Arabs are familiar with, was pretty familiar going all the way across North Africa, and they spread very easily that way all the way to Spain, but had a lot of trouble taking hold in a fairly different terrain and climate zone in Anatolia. Anatolia, by contrast, was very, very much like the steppes of Central Asia. It's like an extra little piece of steppes stuck in there. And so it was very natural now for the Turks who have rolled across all of this to find that and like, oh, this is a great place. This is like home, just like home. So it's very welcoming to Turkish nomads. So, in response to Seljuk invasions of Anatolia, the Byzantine emperor, Romanus IV, led an army, perhaps 40,000 strong, so everybody he could bring, to his eastern frontier. And then while he's there near the city of Manzikert, he meets the Sultan Alp Arslan, the Seljuk Sultan, in a great battle where the Byzantines are totally routed. Romanus IV is taken prisoner. It is the worst debacle in Roman history almost up to that time, causing a blow to which the empire doesn't really ever recover fully. So the loss of the emperor and the army left Anatolia completely open to the Seljuks. Byzantine authority over the area that had been its absolute heartland, as we saw before, that just simply collapsed. And like I say, it never really recovered. The peninsula began its transformation into a region that we now know today as Turkey, right? So we think of that, we don't usually use the word Anatolia anymore. We now just say that's Turkey. That happens now. So they lose control over the whole thing in the immediate time, as the Seljuks go all the way up until they get to the sea. Once again, the empire survives behind the walls of Constantinople. In this case, the water is also helpful because the Turks don't have a big navy at this point. Its secondary heartland that it had restored to the Balkans also it retains, but with just that, the empire lacked the resources to drive out this new threat, the Turks. So we've now gone time past the Greeks and the Arabs over the centuries had eventually kind of learned to accommodate one another. But now we've come to a place where they're no longer the leading forces in Islam and Christianity. All of the Arab states are led here by Turks or by Fatimids and so on in Egypt. And the Byzantines are very much reduced, not the key player anymore in Christianity. By contrast, if we turn at that very same time that Manzikert is happening, this whole loss of Anatolia from the Byzantines, Western Europe is actually surprisingly been on an uptick. So again, when we're only at 1071, this still seems to a lot of people like, whoa, that's the Dark Ages. This is a pretty limited time for what Europeans are actually able to do. But in fact, there has been a very significant recovery as the population, which had been in decline in late antiquity and was fairly low and stable in the early Middle Ages, now has begun growing very rapidly. And this is especially true in northern Italy and France, especially where there's also kind of a renewed capacity to do certainly a growing military capacity. And so, for example, one of the French duchies, Normandy, which had a Viking past, but the Normans had been, now spoke a kind of French and Norman French, and had adapted generally to customs of their contemporary French people. But they had some of the warlike stuff that they'd retained in boat ability and so forth from their Norman past, their Norse past. In 1066, were able to conquer England. And then similarly, Norman adventurers, not officially, so that was the Duke of Normandy that officially conquered England and became the King of England. Just regular knights, second sons, people without any land, had gone and become mercenaries in southern Italy, where they had conquered essentially the territories of the whole south of Italy from both local Lombard leaders and also the remains of Byzantine provinces. And they had begun even reconquering Sicily, which had been in Muslim hands from the Muslims. Similarly, in Spain, that Umayyad Caliphate that had been such a powerful independent state in Spain, in Andalusia, collapsed in 1031. And so suddenly there is just a whole bunch of chaotic, tiny Muslim states that are no longer able to fight against the increasing power of what looks like, you can kind of see, tiny little Christian states. But ultimately the Christian states are able to band together and push back very rapidly the remaining Muslim powers, coordinating it down into the south of the peninsula. So a big resurgence is actually happening here in the 11th century. Part of that is driven by, again, I was mentioning these technological advances that are happening in the Middle Ages. One of these is the adoption of the heavy plow, which northern European soils are thicker and were not able to be farmed as easily with scratch plows the way Mediterranean soils are. And so much more land is able to be brought under cultivation, forests are cleared, swamps are drained, and that results in more food, more population growth. And so by the time we're going to get to like 1100 here at the end of this lecture, France's population may have reached 11 million, which would have been higher than what it would have been at the time of the Roman Empire. So things have reversed and are on the upswing again. Nevertheless, royal authority in France was very limited. If you can kind of see in this map, the area that's in blue kind of around Paris, and it's really a tiny drop, that's the lands that are directly held by the kings of France, the Capetians. And so they had very little power and not too much, a little bit more prestige than power, but nevertheless not that much. And instead, France, as of this time, the 11th century, is largely divided into mostly autonomous principalities. So Flanders and Normandy, Blois-Champagne, Burgundy, Aquitaine, Gascony, Toulouse, Brittany. And these are all the centers of semi-autonomous states that are kind of constantly warring with one another. As we mentioned, one of these, the Duchy of Normandy, the Duke of Normandy, William the Bastard, in 1066 successfully conquers England and becomes the King of England. Other adventurers are trying to conquer one another, or if they could do it, take the French crown, and so on. Lots and lots of continual fighting, which is leading to military prowess. And so there is a development in military technology, including heavily armored cavalry. So in other words, the development of the knight. There's also growth in the use of stone castles for defense, and then also siege equipment that you need to take the castles. So we mentioned that independent Norman mercenaries, adventurers, people who had gone on gone on pilgrimage to Jerusalem, come back, and they've been going through Italy, and they've been seeing kind of the chaos that is existing in southern Italy, the Lombard principalities, and being hired by local lords, and then later taking over the principalities for themselves. They conquered southern Italy, and Roger I of Hauteville, one of these knights, actually begins the conquest of Sicily with just a few dozen knights. Is able to kind of make use of this technology that isn't well known in the Mediterranean in order to ultimately seize control of the island and create a kingdom for himself. So we mentioned at the beginning of this, or a while back, we were talking about Fulk Nera, Fulk the Black, the Count of Anjou, who, like I say, went on those 4 pilgrimages to Jerusalem in his lifetime. So he lived in this era, and he is one of the main innovators in castle warfare. And indeed, even to this day, the Loire Valley, where Anjou is one of these places where there's just these amazing castles. Castles became a big part of that. So the last 2 of his 4 pilgrimages to Jerusalem, he went on those pilgrimages after that Fatimid Caliph of Egypt, Al-Hakim, which people in the West call Hakim the Mad. He wasn't known that way locally, but anyway, he was an enemy to Christians because he destroyed the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So the last 2 of Fulk's pilgrimages took place after that happened. when Christians still wanted to go visit Jerusalem, even though they were very angry about the loss there, and even though it was very dangerous to go. And so Fulk and his is a powerful, essentially semi-autonomous prince who is a knight and who has a bunch of knights. And so he would take other people too, other pilgrims, with him and protect them in an armed pilgrimage to go to Jerusalem. And so that's kind of setting the stage for a much bigger armed pilgrimage. So having lost Anatolia, what's going to become Turkey, to the Seljuk Turks, Constantinople needs help. And so the new emperor, Alexius I Comnenus, he may have been thinking about the ability of Western soldiers, certainly the ability of those ones that the Normans who took control of his southern Italian provinces and also were busy conquering Sicily. And he may well realize, Toledo, the old Visigothic capital of Spain, in 1085 is recaptured by Western knights from Castile and Leon. So the emperor of Constantinople may have had this on his mind when he sends an appeal to the Pope, Pope Urban II, asking for Latin mercenaries, Western mercenaries, to come help him fight against the Seljuk Turks. Whatever his intent, though, what he got was something that was very different from what he wanted. So there was, by the time he's writing to the papacy, the popes are very different than they had been in the past. The popes, as Bishop of Rome, as patriarchs of the Western Patriarchate, they had once more or less acted as officials of the Eastern emperors and had to be confirmed in their position by the Emperor of Constantinople in the past. But any control like that had long since faded away, and the popes had achieved full autonomy. They made new alliances, first with the Frankish kings, the descendants of that Charles Martel, the mayor of the palace, who had defeated the Muslims at Poitiers and saved Gaul. Now, they made the alliance with his grandson or descendant anyway, Charlemagne, crowning Charlemagne as the Western emperor and creating a new Holy Roman Empire, Western Empire. So their alliance then, the popes from that point looked west. Nevertheless, the papacy continued to decline in influence and capacity all the way down into the 10th century when it got to a very low point indeed. And I'll do a lecture, I think, at some point about this because it's a very interesting history. But from that low moment, now, what we're getting to now, the 11th century, there is a reform movement that's named for one of the major reforming popes, Gregory VII, the Gregorian Reform. And this actually elevates papal prestige to new heights and probably the highest power that it had and will ever have in its history. So one of the things that the popes do, or one of the things that's happening in the West, is there is a recovery of Roman law and a study of law. Universities like Bologna are founded that specialize in law and legal theories, and many of these scholars who have degrees now from Bologna and other universities, Paris, come to be part of the papal court, and they bring legal theories that are helping Gregory and his successors. These include ultimately the idea that as head of the church, and therefore as the vicar of Christ on earth, the popes have the ability or have the right to both make kings and emperors. So it's the pope that decides, or the emperor is crowned by the pope, the way the pope initially crowns Charlemagne to make him emperor, and so that tradition has continued in the Western Holy Roman Empire, where the German princes elect a king of the Romans, a king of Germany, who then marches down across the Alps and comes to Rome and is only made emperor when the Pope crowns him. But similarly, Gregory and his lawyers propose that they have the right to unmake kings and emperors, so they can excommunicate kings and put their realms under interdict, and they can absolve all of the king's nobles of their oaths of fealty, so they're no longer effectively king anymore, and indeed they can pick someone new, a more suitable replacement to be king or emperor, and indeed Gregory the Seventh actually exercised those theoretical powers in his battle against the German emperor. So this is a different kind of pope that the Byzantine emperor's embassy is reaching. So when Alexius's embassy reaches Urban II, he finds one of the most able of the reform popes who's definitely following in Gregory VII's footsteps. He believes that he has control of both the two swords, the spiritual sword and the temporal sword. The spiritual sword he wields as pope, the temporal sword he delegates to the secular arm, but it's him who then tells the secular arm what to do. So rather than just gather some mercenaries and send them the way the emperor requests, Urban calls a council of Western bishops who meet together at the city of Clermont in central France. So in the preceding decades, the Western Church, especially in France, had been promoting an idea of the Truce of God and the peace of God. So teaching French knights, Christian knights, that let's not have, you're fighting continually, you're doing all these horrible things. Let's not fight on Easter. Let's not fight during Lent. Let's call truces on Sundays and these kind of things. Let's put some laws together where we are not massacring civilians, too much and that kind of thing. There had been trying to make rules for warfare, but there's also kind of a notion that is pushed forward that it doesn't make sense, or Christians shouldn't be fighting amongst themselves. And if it is your task in the world, if your role is, there's the people whose role it is to farm and to work, there's the people whose job it is to pray and to consider the spiritual things, the clergy and the monks. There's the people whose calling or role it is to fight, that really that fighting should be turned towards Christendom's outward enemies. And so at Clermont, during this council, actually in an open-air speech where he tells the whole population, not just the bishops, Pope Urban II directs this weapon, the second sword, the secular sword, eastwards towards Jerusalem. So Urban II explains in his speech at Clermont, as many of you have been told, the Turks, a Persian race, we just heard of the Turks before in the West. Anyway, a Persian race have overrun the Eastern Christians right up to the Mediterranean Sea, occupying more and more of the lands of the Christians on the borders of Romania, which is to say the lands of the Romans, not what we think of as Romania today, but it has the same meaning. So by Romania, he means Turkey. They have conquered them, slaughtering and capturing many, destroying churches and laying waste to the kingdom of God. So, if you leave them alone much longer, they will further grind under their heels the faithful of God. Urban argues further that French knights should make a truce among each other because this is a big deal. This land you inhabit, France, is shut in on all sides by the seas, and it's surrounded by mountain peaks. It's too narrow for your large population, nor does it abound in wealth, and it furnishes scarcely food enough for its cultivators. Hence, it is that you murder one another, that you wage war, and that you frequently perish by mutual wounds. Let therefore hatred depart from among you, let your quarrels end, let wars cease, and let all dissensions and controversies slumber. You're all fighting, all of you warriors, all of you knights of France, because there's just not enough lands for younger sons, for example. That's why younger sons run off to Italy and Sicily or Spain in order to find new lands for themselves. I get it, he's saying. Have I got something for you? So Urban says, enter upon the road to the holy sepulchre. Wrest that land from the wicked race and subject it to yourselves. There's land over there, guys. God has conferred upon you above all nations great glory and arms. Accordingly, undertake this journey for the remission of your sins, with the assurance of imperishable glory of the kingdom of heaven. So Urban combines a bunch of things here. The fact that these knights need land. He also combines the Truce of God, the idea that Christian knights shouldn't fight among themselves and should instead be fighting against the enemies of Christendom. And he adds to that the idea that pilgrimage can expiate sin. So in the same way that folk went to Jerusalem as a pilgrim in order to recover from that original sin and be forgiven from that sin, now Urban is saying, look, let's formalize this. All of you guys, if you get together in this big army, that will cause a remission of your sins, and you're going to, in addition to any land and glory that you get in the present, that's going to give you imperishable glory in the kingdom of heaven. So, Urban's speech really captured the popular imagination. This picture here is, the circle is a medieval Latin vision of Jerusalem. The city was never a circle, unlike Baghdad, but it's often portrayed that way in diagrams and maps so that it's shown as being perfect. And sometimes it's shown as a circle within the circle of the world, and it's pictured in the medieval imagination at the place where the continents come together. So if you're looking at the Mediterranean, and the Asia forms the top of the circle, and then Europe and Africa, and Jerusalem is right at the center in this imagination. So Urban's speech, has a more popular response than even he imagines. And for one thing, it captures the attention not just of a bunch of knights and second sons who want to go have land and who actually have the capacity maybe to fight, but actually just common people. And so it causes a popular crusades, peasants' crusades, where groups of people who don't know how to fight but who want to go just start marching the land route across Germany through Hungary and on their way to Constantinople without the money or provisions to do that. And so unfortunately causing devastation in their wake as they have to rob and get food and make their way, and are in some cases put down or slaughtered by Christian kings who want to stop them. But in any event, all of those popular crusades, some of them actually do make it to Anatolia, where everybody is killed by the Muslims because they're not fighters. Urban tries to stop people from doing that, actually forbids women and children and infirm people from going, especially, but nothing really can stop them. None of the kings in the West take up the cause. So the King of England, the King of France, the kings of the Spanish countries, the Holy Roman Emperor, and the First Crusade anyway, don't go. But a very large number of these autonomous princes, the dukes and counts of France, do go. So that includes Raymond of Toulouse that we mentioned, so the head of this large state in southern France, and the second largest stateholder down there too, the Duke of Normandy, Robert Curthose, who is the older brother of the King of England. He actually in order to finance his trip, he actually mortgages Normandy to his brother in order to get there. Robert of Flanders, the area now of Belgium that's extremely wealthy. Also the Counts of Blois, a bunch of other high leaders, the brother of the King of France, the brother of the King of England, but not the kings themselves. So they form much more capable armies, which get underway really fast and also march across the land route, or in some cases going down to Italy and across the Adriatic to the Balkans, and ultimately make their way to Constantinople. So, fortunately for the Crusaders, between 1092 and 1094, all of the leaders of the major Muslim powers died, and so that led to a fracturing of the Great Seljuk Sultanate. And so some of the other Turks become autonomous and set up their own little kingdoms that they just get started. So for example, there are the Danishmen Turks who take over northern Anatolia, and there are the Seljuks of Rum who make their capital in Nicaea, so just across from Constantinople. So Rum here means Rome. So essentially, the Sultan of this new Seljuk state is kind of declaring, I am now the Sultan of Rome. My capital right now is Nicaea, but guess what my capital is going to be as soon as I take over Constantinople? So they're intending to stay, and they're intending to hold on to that, but they're much smaller than if, let's say, the great Seljuk Sultanate the Sultan was still in power and controlled the whole territory. Meanwhile, the Fatimid Caliph also dies and is succeeded, and the successor takes advantage of the Seljuks' chaos, and so, for example, attacks and retakes Jerusalem. So we mentioned at the very beginning of this lecture that the Fatimids were the ones that owned Jerusalem and were garrisoning in it. That's because, again, the whole territory is sort of in chaos during this time period. Whenever a monarchy is having a succession, that's when it's in the most crisis and chaos. So all of these armies, including hordes who are not armies, descend on Constantinople. This makes the emperor frightened that they're going to try to take over Constantinople. This is the last thing that he wanted. He wanted to hire some mercenaries to help out and maybe besiege Nicaea. The Crusaders maybe think that the emperor is going to lead them as lead them now to Jerusalem. He has no intention of doing that, but he does ferry them across the Bosporus to Anatolia, and he coordinates with them to attack Nicaea, which they are able to conquer. And so at the very beginning anyway, there's still relatively good feelings between the Byzantines and the Crusaders. Over time that deteriorates. So having retaken Nicaea, they move on to Dorylaeum. We have here one of the Muslim chroniclers, the chronicler of Damascus, Ibn al-Qalanisi, who says, in that year, news began to trickle in about the appearance of the Frange, which is how the Franks, essentially. This is how the Arabs identify Western Christians. So Frange troops coming down from the Sea of Marmara in an innumerable multitude. People took fright. The information was confirmed. King Kilij Arslan, so the Sultan of the Rum, the Seljuk Turks of Rum, Sultan of Rome, he's saying, his territory was closest to the Frange. And so when the armies actually got there, the heavily armored cavalrymen, so the knight, that was something that was new to the region. Turkish fighting was light cavalry with archers, and they weren't initially prepared or understood tactics for how to fight these heavily armored cavalry. And so as a result of that, at Dorylaeum, we read again from Ibn al-Qalanisi, the chronicler of Damascus, the Franj, the Franks, the Crusaders, cut the Turkish army to pieces. They killed, pillaged, and took many prisoners who were sold into slavery. When this event, so shameful for Islam, became known, there was a real panic. Dread and anxiety swelled to enormous proportions. So with that, after that battle, the crusading army, although diminished, was able to march the rest of the way across Anatolia without any resistance. However, it did, the Seljuk Sultan had taken the precaution of destroying all of the crops and provisions and everything like that. So they got across to the end of this yellow area here, which is called here the Principality of Armenian Cilicia, so a Christian territory where the Crusaders allied with the Armenians in order to take the city of Edessa, which is in Mesopotamia. So although like I say, reduced in numbers, the Crusaders were able to pretty easily march across Anatolia. They crossed into Syria. They conquered in Mesopotamia the small Armenian city of Edessa, which had long been a Christian city. So this part of the idea here is that, again, they're not as interested in Anatolia, but also the Byzantine emperor more or less told them, anything that you take back in Anatolia, that's mine. So when they took back Nicaea, they had to give it immediately to the emperor, and they weren't allowed to pillage it. So that meant that they couldn't essentially pay troops. The only way that medieval troops are able to be paid is by taking a city, storming it, and being pillaging and that kind of thing. So so now they're outside of that territorial zone, and they are able to kind of claim Edessa, a historically Christian city but hadn't been for a long time, and create that as the center of a new Crusader state. They then went and laid siege to Antioch, which had been the capital of the Roman East and is a center, one of the centers of the patriarchates of early Christianity. There were plenty of local Seljuk leaders, Turkish leaders in Antioch itself, also Aleppo, Damascus, Mosul. Unfortunately, though, they were completely divided. Unfortunately for their side, they were completely divided, and they were also more worried about losing their individual cities to each other than they really were about the Crusaders. So the ruler of Mosul sent a large relief force to Antioch, but the other treachery from and desertion by other local Seljuk leaders left them unguarded, and so it caused a rout when the Crusaders were able to both take the city of Antioch and then also the relief force. So the Crusaders set up their first states. So they created Edessa as a new county and Antioch as a principality, and they continued their march south towards Jerusalem, which I mentioned was recently captured from the Seljuks by the Fatimids. So Al-Afdal, the vizier of the Fatimid Caliphate, took it. And there's this is a contemporary Muslim chronicler, Ibn al-Athir, or a little later, who is kind of expressing the division here within Islam, because he records, some say that when the masters of Egypt, when the Fatimids saw the expansion of the Seljuk Empire, they took fright and asked the Crusaders to come to Syria to establish a buffer between them and the Muslims. God alone knows the truth. So the division is such that rumors are that the other sides, even the other Muslims, are actually causing the Crusaders to come here in order to create a buffer state or to get an advantage against their Muslim neighbors and so on. So aftermath, so you can kind of see now in the map here of the Crusader states as they got established ultimately by 1135. The northernmost one, the county of Edessa, and the Principality of Antioch, county of Tripoli, and then the Kingdom of Jerusalem. So in contrast, actually, to pretty much all of the later Crusades, The First Crusade was surprisingly successful, especially given the cost and the distance involved. I think I would attribute it to the idea that medieval technology had gotten to a certain level where there was a lot of power to these armor and the knights' charges and the ability to build these castles and all these kind of things, but it hadn't gotten so far where that was too expensive to transport everything. So later Crusades were much more expensive because armor and horses and everything became so much more expensive and had to be shipped by water. In this case, the Crusaders were able to kind of make their way by land, and they had to forage for themselves, kind of destroy everything along the way, much to the chagrin of even the Christian states along the way, like Hungary and Byzantium. And so they were able to accomplish this pretty unexpected thing. They also, of course, though, had the advantage of surprise, the fact that the defenders had no experience with their kind of fighting and equipment, and also especially the fact that the local leaders were all divided against one another. And indeed, because of that, the leaders of Aleppo and Damascus and Mosul and Egypt all maintained their independence, and they reached kind of a new kind of status quo with the Crusader states as being part of their mix. And so as a result, the Crusaders were allowed to consolidate their power, building up 4 states: Edessa, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Tripoli. And so just kind of to put that into context, so if we do like a timeline of the control of, kind of coastal Palestine, Outremer, as the Crusaders called it, over the land overseas, the Crusader states, the shore of the Crusader states, from the time period when it's Roman and then part of the pagan empire to the conversion of the empire to being a Christian empire, with a brief little time period when it's controlled by the Zoroastrian Sassanid Persians. There's about 331 years that the coastline there is in Christian hands. Then there's 462 years after the Arab conquest, all the way through till the Crusader conquest. Then 192 years of the Crusader states. Then 626 years after the Muslims recover the lands and hold it all the way through to the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the beginning of Western colonialism when the British take control of the coast. Until now, into the post-World War II era, when that is now owned by the State of Israel, Jewish state. So that's sort of just looking at that in terms of perspective and how many years any of those things have been around. So the Crusader states were, we think of them now as being something that is totally gone and maybe sort of crazy, but it did have a fairly long interlude of history there at the beginning, or in the Central Middle Ages. And so with that is what I wanted to present anyway about the context of the First Crusade, how it came about, and why it was successful. And so I'm going to have some water, and then Mike has hopefully been monitoring your questions, and we'll maybe be able to have some discussion. So Mark, I'll begin by just thanking people for your support. So thanks to Mark Long, to Dave Anderson, to Soringbaum and M, to Carney Defoe, and to Daryl Scott. I really appreciate that. Like I say, it helps us to keep doing these. Gary Talbot asks, did the Crusaders kill everybody in the city, including Christians and Armenians? So they wouldn't have killed the Christians. So they didn't kill every single person. There was not a big Christian and Armenian population. Some people might have gotten killed by accident, but they were not trying to kill anyway Christians that were in the city. But there was a very small proportion anybody who would have been in there. They might have already been expelled, any Christians, by the people who were, the defenders of the city, so as not to have any potential anybody to open the gates up or something like that. They also spared some of the leaders. The governor, the Muslim governor, was able to get away, and so it's in general it was a big massacre, but there were some people spared. Roan Wagner asks, are Samaritans still considered separate from other Jews? Yes. So the Samaritans are their own ongoing religion. It is a very tiny religion now, based in Palestine primarily. I think there's a big community. There's a community in Israel and a community in Palestine. So the Samaritans, have their own history. They had their own revolts against the Roman Empire and had their own massacres by the Romans. As so many minority religions do, when they're part of a bigger society, they cease to be allowed to convert anybody else. And the Samaritans also have made kind of a strict rules about being genetically Samaritan. So in other words, if you marry in and things, I think that means it's much maybe not a Samaritan. And so the population has dwindled to a very small number, but they are still a separate religion from Rabbinic Judaism. And so it's an Israelite religion that's separate from that. Jafroli Evertinitz asks, were the early Jews ever spoken of as an original different race of human, or were they considered a mix of different races as we understand race today? Well, so I don't know how we understand race today. So race is I think we understand today that race is largely a construct. So there was in the 19th and early 20th century, there was an obsession with race that was mostly, about, a bunch of superficial things, so for example, white Irish people were not considered part of the white race initially, and so because it was a construct, right? And it's still not, there are different genetic groups that are in different places, and so for example, Jews, because they often have less intermarriage, so throughout the Middle Ages, they were a minority group that in a lot of cases was not doing a lot of intermarrying, so they're genetically distinct. So in the way if that's maybe a way that we understand race, if we understand race that way. Nowadays, I think in the United States, I think most people understand Jews to be white. That was if we understand what white is, white is a construct as well. So I guess, so I'm not sure how to say anything about so yes, they're thought of as being different by Christians, but not necessarily as a race. They're, and maybe as a race in the old-fashioned medieval way of talking about race. I mean, we saw in the quotation from Urban II that he's talking about the Turks as a race, and so in that sense, they're using the word race to mean kind of ethnicity, I think is how we would talk about it, and so they're an ethnicity. In terms of being considered a mix of different races, so probably not. So it would have initially been one ethnicity. It is a universal religion, so you can convert people. And so at that point, you can be, let's say, a Jewish convert. You would technically not have that genetic background, but you would be part of the religion. So maybe that's what you mean. Paul asks, I legit thought the title of this was, "What if Caesar led the First Crusade?" And when I clicked on this, well, that would be kind of fun. So that is maybe some kind of counterfactual. I don't know what that would mean. So Caesar, I presume you mean maybe Julius Caesar, and so as opposed to a later Caesar. So So in terms of Caesar ultimately becomes a title for emperor, and there was an emperor, a Kaiser from the Holy Roman Empire from Germany, Frederick Barbarossa, who led not the First Crusade, but he led a grouping on the Third Crusade, the same crusade that Richard the Lionhearted and King Philip Augustus went on. And so that is a Caesar. That Frederick Barbarossa is a Caesar who led a crusade, the Third Crusade, one of the leaders. But but I think it's just a funny thought. So yeah, Julius Caesar predates Christianity, so it would be hard for him to lead a crusade. So Roan Wagner says, when did the name change back to Jerusalem from Aelia Capitolina? So, it was always, whenever a city has a name, it often still has that name. So, Istanbul is Constantinople. Now it's Istanbul, So Istanbul is simply the Turkish version of a Greek slang for the city, which means something like going to the city. And so it was called the city because it was the most important city, and so now that's its official name. But we still know what Constantinople is if we talk about it. It's the same city as Istanbul. So people would have still talked about Jerusalem because it would have still had that name in the Bible. So people would have been talking about Jerusalem in synagogue, and they would have been talking about it in church, and it would have been and in religion. So that name would have continued to exist. But like I say, the name Aelia was still there when the Muslims took over, which is why the Arab name for it becomes Ilia. And then because it's also a holy city of Islam, it becomes known as Al-Quds, the Holy. And then it also always has had the name Jerusalem. So the name, maybe Ilia is still being used in Arabic, but for the Crusaders, they called it Jerusalem. Already when the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem is set up, they're no longer using the name Aelia. That's been forgotten. So they're thinking about Jerusalem because they read about it in the Bible, and so it's called Jerusalem again for the Latin Christians who set up the kingdom of Jerusalem. Michael Luz says, since Julian, the Emperor Julian, 2 generations after Constantine, wanted to rebuild the Jewish temple, when did Aelia become essentially Christian? So Julian, who is known to history now as Julian the Apostate because he was raised Christian but then decided that he didn't like Christianity and he wanted to fight against it and also revive the religion of the old gods, Greco-Roman paganism, and support that and do other things like that. And so maybe he had some overtures, like you say, to Jews in order to maybe rebuild the temple. But all of Julian's plans came to naught because he died. And so when Julian's reign was a failure, that caused any plans that he had to collapse. And his successors were all Christians, and within a generation or two after that, Christianity becomes the state religion of the Roman Empire under Theodosius. And so it happens in those generations. There was not any proposal that Julian might have had about that to any Jewish leaders came to naught, and nothing ever came of that. I think Christians, though, did let Jews come to the city, and so and same thing certainly Muslims did. And so Jewish people did start moving back to the city, even though the city became essentially Christian, and then later essentially Muslim. Despite the terrible history, including during the First Crusade, where some of these popular crusaders went because they went and just attacked local Jewish communities in Europe, that was also, though, not allowed. So in terms of the religion, so that is going against the religion, even if it's coming out of a popular religious fervor. Under Christianity, the Jews were protected people that were subject directly to the different Christian kings, in the same way that Christians and Jews are both protected technically under Islam, but again, sometimes they don't do according to what the religion teaches, and they get massacred because that happens when a minority is existing under a majority. Operation IV-85 says, with the destruction of the Second Temple, did the rabbinical leadership think or write about any direct comparisons to the First Temple and the subsequent exile diaspora? That's interesting. So there was definitely a there was definitely a continuity of the diaspora. So even though there was a lot of focus on the Second Temple during the Second Temple period, and of course there was a whole group of elite Jews, the Sadducees, who are in Jerusalem and who are taking part in the temple rituals. There are other groups like the Essenes that are really focused on the temple and everything like that during the Second Temple period. Nevertheless, there are large Jewish communities that continued during the Second Temple period to live in diaspora. So Alexandria maybe housed the biggest Jewish community and in Egypt. And there was another very large diaspora community in Babylon, continued to be throughout that kind of Second Temple period. And so when Jerusalem and the temple are destroyed, that there's a continuity of the diaspora experience, and which that has continued to this day when, whereas obviously the state of Israel since the middle of the 20th century has come back in, or has come into existence, and now has the largest population of Jewish people on the planet. It's nevertheless, I think it's not, therefore, though, not a majority, because there's almost as many that are living in the United States. And so that, in addition to everybody, adds up to at least anyway, about half of Jewish people are living in diaspora even now. And so diaspora continues to be it was certainly the place in which Second Temple Judaism really sort of came into existence, or where Judaism came into existence as a distinct religion. And obviously then through the whole course of all of history, that's where the religion gained its resilience and most of its characteristics, and it's only very recently that some Jews are not in diaspora anymore. And so that comparison, I think, was there and alive at the time. The Elk of Antioch says, what knowledge or traditions explain what happened to James's church, and the bloodline of Jesus's family? So the idea of it is that, so James is martyred, and then the tradition has it that Jude, the brother of James, the brother of Jesus, takes over the leadership of the Jerusalem church. The Jerusalem church, the idea of it is that during that Roman-Jewish war, when Jerusalem is destroyed, the Christians don't fight, and instead they flee to the city of Pella in Palestine, and so that becomes the new center of the Jamesian church. And so the traditions go on that there are Jewish Christians, so Christians who continue to practice Jewish law, and that continues through to the end of, to the, frankly, it's probably happening all the way up until the Romans lose control of Syria, but in a certain amount of decline. So the family of James, the brother of Jesus, and Jude, the brother of Jesus, they would have continued there, but there are no, I think, extensive traditions that I'm aware of a bloodline continuing down. There's like modern fantasies like the Da Vinci Code, which are nonsense that have been made, but it's not traditions that go all the way back in terms of the bloodline. But ultimately, Jewish Christians, the Ebionites and so on, make their way out of the Roman Empire to the east, to Mesopotamia, and also to Arabia. And that's why, like I say, they may have had some influence on Muhammad, who knew some Christians, but Christians who were not probably Nicene Christians. Kaiwan FD asks, F8 asks, is the subterranean chapel of the Holy Sepulchre, St. Helena's Chapel, and then that one that goes all the way down to where the true cross is that still extant? Yes, my understanding is it is. It's on the diagrams. I have to say, I have not been to Jerusalem myself personally. I'd like to go, but obviously there's a lot going on there, and there has been ever since I've been an adult. Certainly a lot right now, and so I haven't been able to, but my understanding is it's still extant, and you can visit it if you go as a pilgrim to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Fabiano Gritti says, Pirin proposed that this period as the beginning of the Middle Ages in Europe. And so essentially, I think what you're talking about there is that the proposal is that when Islam bursts out of, I think he was suggesting when it bursts out of the desert and conquers both the Persian Empire and also Syria and Egypt and all the way across, that's what ends antiquity. That's what the Middle Ages begins, and so again, this is a question of kind of periodization. So the time period that's just 100 years later than that and before that, both of those two times on either side of the end of ancient times and the beginning of medieval times, both of those two times are going to be closer to each other than what existed 500 or 600 years before that, or 500 years later. But nevertheless, you have to, when you're doing periodization, you have to kind of pick a time. And so I think that, as you say, Piren points this out as as good a place as any to make a divide. So Operation Ivy 85. How Arabic and how Greek/Roman were Syria and Egypt prior to the Sassanid conquest? Do ethnic differences contribute to and or exacerbate the theological ones you mentioned? So that's a good point. So Syria and Egypt had been many centuries within the Roman Empire. And before that, many more centuries within the Hellenistic empires. And so, it had been Greek, the elites in the cities had been Greek speaking for, what is that now? 800 years, something like that. So it's pretty entrenched. Nevertheless, the locals, the peasantry, did not all start speaking Greek, unlike in Anatolia. So Anatolia, in what we now think of as Turkey, the locals all spoke Greek at a certain point. They had given up on speaking, Lydian and Phrygian and all of those kind of languages. They are still speaking a version of Aramaic, Syriac, by the time the Arabs get there, and they're still speaking, like a late Egyptian Coptic in Egypt. And so both of those, Syriac and Coptic, are Semitic languages. They're both therefore distantly related or related to Arabic, and so it's therefore easier for Egyptians and Syrians to give up Syriac and Coptic and start speaking Arabic, which they do, albeit their own Syrian and Egyptian versions of Arabic, but are still largely, it's the Arabic language that replaces it. And so, how does it contribute? So, I think it could that could contribute on the peasant level in terms of converting people, but it doesn't have to. You're able to convert large groups of people without the same language. That may be a factor, though. Like you say, there's that they have in common. They have a similar Semitic, languages. Rain Weber asks, how did the Crusades influence the formation of the modern state of Israel? Did support by Western nations for the fledgling state represent a modern crusade by proxy? So I don't know that they have that kind of direct influence. The direct model for the state of Israel isn't going all the way back to Crusades, which were a very different kind of time and what it even means to have a state. So when you have a state in the Middle Ages, they didn't, they killed everybody in Jerusalem. Yes, that's a city, but they didn't kill everybody in the kingdom of Jerusalem, in Palestine. They almost everybody who was there continued to be, there were local Christians, of course, but they continued to largely just be Muslim peasants and Muslim peasants that are not speaking. They're certainly not speaking Latin, which becomes the new language for 200 years of the elite. So they don't. So you have those nations there, but they are not nations the way we think of modern nation states and nationalism and that kind of a thing. It's a kind of ancient times, medieval times, where countries are more about, in a way, the elite that takes over. It's the Normans now rule England, and all of the locals are still speaking Anglo-Saxons, but the state is the Norman Kingdom of England, where they're speaking Norman French. So it's very different when you get to the modern time with Israel, which is it's in an era of nationalism. So there had just been greatest kind of ethnic cleansing that ever happened in certainly on the one hand the Holocaust, but then in general in Europe the sorting out and the aftermath of World War II. There is this vast migration of everybody who, as they create nation states, they kick Germans out of the east, they kick Poles out of the eastern part, they kick Germans out and move Poles to where Germany was, and everybody homogenizes into nation states in the aftermath of World War II. And the same kind of thing happens when India gets partitioned and they decide that it's a national characteristic of Pakistan and Bangladesh to have it be Muslim, and so then there's a huge population transfer there. So this is the era when a state of Israel is being created. It's not an elite that goes and conquers some territory. It's like you're going to have a whole nation of all the people that is going to be put there. And so that is more in that era of nationalism, and also on the model of imperialism and colonialism, which was also at its end at that moment, but right in that era that informs it, not the Crusades. Josh Bedford asks, how should we contextualize the Crusades in 2024? Clash of civilizations, European hubris, legitimate counteroffensive, dark age barbarism, other, all, none. So yeah, it's like I was kind of even just saying in the last answer, this is a very different era, and what everybody's doing is different. It's there's some hubris there in the sense that this is a really, in a way, it's a really crazy thing to do in the sense of anything that's self-interested. There isn't, this was a very expensive and ultimately not sustainable undertaking for the younger sons, or let's say, of the nobility of France to constantly be sending everybody to a colony across the other side of the Mediterranean. It doesn't end up being functional to do that. It's much easier to expand much more locally, right? And so it's much more sustainable to ship everybody across the Pyrenees and expand into Andalusia and into Spain, which ends up being a sustainable undertaking. So, I mean, it does, I guess, show remarkable, if I think misguided, religious fervor. It's amazing that all of these people, most of these nobles actually lost everything. They spent everything in order to go there, and certainly all of the peasants the tens of thousands of peasants who kind of tried to march to places when they had no capacity and didn't get anywhere close often, and generally speaking got massacred. It's an interesting kind of religious devotion that I don't know, man. I feel like if I was in the Middle Ages, I wouldn't have done it, but I would have loaned my brother the money and hawked, let him hawk Normandy, and then when he leaves, take it over the way Henry I did, as opposed to the person who runs off and does it. Nevertheless, it's very clearly something that is born out of remarkable religious fervor that is an interesting phenomenon, part of human nature to go back and look to. In terms of legitimate counteroffensive, so in Clash of Civilizations, this is a kind of thing that was only beginning to evolve. So initially, when Islam spreads out across and conquers all the way up through to Spain, I wouldn't even necessarily think that anybody in, let's say, the Christian realms of Egypt, North Africa, and Spain really thought of that as a clash of civilizations, because they didn't have this same the same context that we have. They certainly are before anything like the idea of nationalism and a nation state, and largely the elites were not thinking in those terms. And so even when the Crusaders are getting there, and there's clearly a religious war that is taking place, and it's not like the Muslims don't have any context for religious war. They've been involved in that, they understand it. Nevertheless, a lot of these local emirs, as we saw in Mosul and Damascus, and they're ready, for their own self-interest to ally with the local Christians in order to maintain their autonomy against, let's say, a big sultan who might want to establish a Muslim empire and wipe out this little emir dynasty and things like that. So it's not entirely only clash of civilizations either. So, and in terms of barbarism, I would say that it was barbaric. Clearly, there's no especially the massacre at Jerusalem, but nevertheless there was that kind of thing that continued to happen. That was not particularly unusual in the Middle Ages and antiquity, and really all the way up into really pretty recent modern times in warfare. It's not a good thing, but it is not a totally unusual thing. Carney Defoe asks, I read about the floor tiles discovered or rediscovered in the mosque on the Temple Mount, which were described as being Crusader in origin. Did the Crusaders occupy and modify these structures? Yes. So for a couple, not the whole time, but anyway, for a long period of time, Jerusalem becomes the capital of the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem, and that the main shrine, of course, becomes the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Nevertheless, now that the Crusaders have got a hold of it, they own now the Temple Mount, the Haram al-Sharif, the Muslim sacred precinct. They, as usually, nowadays there will be cases where when the religions come into contact with each other, some mosques might be allowed to stay a mosque, and some churches, if the city gets conquered by a Muslim, then maybe some of the churches get to stay as churches, whereas others are converted to mosques. So when the Turks take control of Constantinople, the main church, Hagia Sophia, becomes the big mosque, but Little Church gets, the Patriarch of Constantinople gets to keep one of the littler churches as his headquarters. So there might have been, in Jerusalem they didn't let any Muslims stay, but anyway, the mosques get converted. And so one of the military orders, so knights who take a vow of celibacy, a vow to be warrior monks, found these military orders that are dedicated to defending the Holy Land. And so the most famous of these orders are the Hospitallers and the Knights Templar. And the Knights Templar are called the Templars because the King of Jerusalem gave them the Temple Mount. And so they called the Dome of the Rock the temple. So as far as medieval Christians were concerned at this point, the Crusaders were concerned, Solomon's temple is the Dome of the Rock. The Dome of the Rock was Solomon's temple, and they revered it as such. And then And then they considered the Al-Aqsa Mosque, they considered that to be the Palace of Solomon, and below it Solomon's stables. And so that became the headquarters for the Knights Templar, and so they used those as their buildings, and so they kept the upkeep of them, and they would have modified them, making them into Christian churches. So yes, they did occupy and modify those structures. Operation Ivy 85 asks, was Alexius unaware of the Pope's new stature and influence, and was he expecting a more compliant response? Or was he aware, and was he just hoping for the best with the embassy? I think he was aware. I mean, he was aware that the popes were no longer his officials. That had not been true for hundreds of years, right? So the popes have been on their own for a long time, and I think he was hoping for the best. I think that there's nobody could have predicted that Urban II was going to do what he did. so I don't think that you can't blame Alexius for not thinking up this thing that Urban did, which was totally kind of unprecedented and it's like a crazy thing that you wouldn't expect somebody to do. So I think that this is yes, he knows there's mercenaries. He hopes maybe the popes are going to be the kind of official who is going to be a little sympathetic to their request. So he's not going to call the Normans of southern Italy. Those guys want to conquer the Byzantine Empire. They have conquered the Byzantine provinces of southern Italy, and they're busily attacking Muslim Sicily, which the Byzantines concerned, as far as they're concerned, that's their province too. So they're not going to just call the Normans directly and try to get mercenaries that way, because those guys are not to be trusted by the Byzantines anyway. And so they want to find somebody with a sympathetic ear. The Pope is probably your best bet. Again, they also have contacts with the Venetians. The Venetians are also very scary. It's not going to take too many more hundred years before 200 years later, that the Venetians essentially hijack a crusade in order to conquer Constantinople for themselves. So they're also dangerous. So they don't have a lot of good contacts. And so I think it's, you got to try to find a mercenary somewhere, and that's probably as good a person to write as anybody. Sphinx 4 asks, how much of a role did Muslim invasion play in the reaction of the Crusades? The Muslims had penetrated to Spain and Sicily. So the Muslim invasions of Spain and Sicily was old. So that didn't play anything at all, because actually the Muslims at the time were on the decline massively in Spain. So Andalusia had been a major Muslim center, so the Caliphate of Cordoba. But now already, whatever it is, 60 years before the First Crusade gets going, the Caliphate collapsed. Spain gets divided, Muslim Spain gets divided into like 20 little tiny states called the party states, the Taifa states. And the Christians are able to just pick them off one by one by one. And so already, even before the Crusade gets going, the Christians, who had just been a little tiny fringe at the north, they've penetrated all the way down to the heart of Spain, to Toledo, which had been the capital of the Visigothic Spain, and they've reconquered that. So they're not worried about any recent invasion of Spain. They're actually on the advance in Spain. And in terms of Sicily, Sicily had been lost again to the Byzantines. And it was a while ago, and once again, the Normans are kind of busily taking it over. It's only going to be another decade, and they'll have conquered it back. And so they're not really reacting to those. They are reacting, yes, to the Muslim invasion of Anatolia, what we now think of as Turkey. So that's the thing that causes the Byzantine emperor to write to the West and say, hey, we got to have some help here. The Muslims are, the Turks, this new race of Muslims, this new kind of Muslim we got over here, Turks, they are really frying our bacon, and we, like I said, wouldn't use bacon, but anyway, they're really getting us, and so we need help. And so that invasion is what is a reaction, not Spain or Sicily. J.A. asks, is there any documentation about what the Oriental Orthodox communities contributed to this story? So yes, and so, yeah, I kind of, at a certain point when we're doing all of this context, there's all this complexity. It's hard to document everything. But so there are still, like you say, by the time the Crusaders get to Edessa and also then Antioch, they're now entering into territories where there are Syriac Christians and Assyrian Christians, in addition to the Armenians, who I did mention. So, and then when they get to Egypt, they're not quite Egypt, but anyway, when they get to the borders of Egypt, there are lots of Coptic Christians. And so, obviously, even though that territory was in what's now Turkey had been completely taken over very recently by the Seljuk Turks, so they control it. The map looks Turkish. Nevertheless, all the people, all the peasants in all of Anatolia would have been Greek, and some of them were helping out as the armies were going through, but in general, peasants don't like anybody's army because they're stealing all your food and burning your houses and all that kind of thing. Likewise, apparently, yes, some of the Syriac Christians and others were contributing intelligence, helping the Crusaders out, and certainly the Armenians that were in Cilicia and Edessa were helping out, and ultimately Cilicia, which is in southeastern Anatolia, the coastal area there above, just to the north of Syria, that becomes an independent Armenian principality, which is effectively one of the Crusader states now for the next couple centuries. And so there's some alliance with them in that sense, yes. Gracious Greek asks, did you mention that knights were not allowed to engage in combat before the Crusade? Well, so what I was saying is that, knights, that's their job. They have to engage in combat. But the church had made, I did mention that the church had made a lot of attempts to make knights less warlike and less dangerous at all times. And so they had introduced these ideas of the peace of Christ and the truce of God in order to prevent fighting against other Christians on certain days, to not just massacre indiscriminately Christian populations and that kind of a thing. And so they were aware that knights were continually doing those kind of things at all times, but in some cases, if you're being very egregious, you could get excommunicated for some of the things that you're doing in violation of those acts. Lots of knights were able to live big long time, including the King of France at this time is actually excommunicated. And one of the reasons why he might not have gone on crusade or responded to the crusade. So you can go live a long time being excommunicated, but yeah, that's, I guess, one of the things maybe I'm getting at what you're asking about. So Atlas Orlova asks, can you explain this in context with the Jewish exile from the Holy Land until the Messiah comes? Well, I don't know that. So I don't know that. So all of Jewish messianism has to be about that the diaspora, that the exile is going to last until the Messiah comes. At a certain point, the exile had been going on long enough that maybe some Jewish theologians and theorists equated the two. In other words, that we'll only have an end of exile when the Messiah comes, because it's going to go on for so long. That hasn't ended up for Rabbinic Judaism. That hasn't ended up being the case, right? Because we're now, whatever it is, 70 years or so into a Jewish state. So the exile doesn't have to remain for, if that's your goal in practicing Judaism, and the Messiah for Jews hasn't come from their understanding of what the Messiah is. And not all Jews are I think, focused on a Messiah anymore, although some are. Corey Bell asks, theologically, how does conquest grant salvation? I know that there's a long tradition of martyrdom bringing salvation, but that doesn't seem to be what the Pope had in mind when he sent them. So yeah, this is an interesting innovation, is what I would say. So yeah, there was a big, this is also talking about a transformation of how Christianity operated. So if we go back to the first centuries of Christianity, there was a big tradition of people understanding, early Christians understanding that one of the ways of following Jesus was that Jesus was a martyr whose testimony was sealed in blood when he was crucified. And as the Christians were protesting and trying to maintain the right to their religion in the face of persecution from the Roman state, many of them, while not maybe seeking martyrdom, sometimes welcomed martyrdom when the Romans threw them to the lions or executed them in other different ways because of the idea that that would then lead to salvation. But that is a nonviolent, passive resistance leading to salvation. Now we have, with the Gregorian Reformed papacy, the idea that an armed pilgrimage where you are fighting to protect Christendom, that is going to actually bring about, anyway, at least a release of sins, right? And so this is, in general, I think, building more on an idea that of how penance and other kinds of penances have built up and worked in Christianity, in the Latin West, in the Middle Ages. And so when you do such and such a bad act, then you go to confession and you are given a penance of having to do this or that act. And so one of those things, an extreme penance, is actually, like Fulk of Anjou did, go all the way on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem and back. And so now Pope Urban is kind of bringing those ideas together and saying by fulfilling the call of the Pope, who delegates the secular sword here, the temporal sword, to you as knights, now knights who take the cross and who are soldiers of Christ. Now this thing that you do, which would normally be a sin, which is attack and kill everybody, now it's actually a good thing. And so it is a big twist from where this had come, and it shows how the thinking theologically has evolved from the first centuries of Christianity to now the central Middle Ages. Michelangelo asks, were the Knights Templar formed after the First Crusade or later? What was its real purpose, not all the myths around them later? So they're formed after the First Crusade. So there is a flowering of religious orders in the Middle Ages. So we start having a bunch of, we start with, in the West, primarily with like Benedictine monks and Cluniacs and things like that. But then it starts to be lots of other different kinds of monastic orders, Augustan canons, Cistercians, and ultimately Franciscans and Dominicans. And simultaneously, while all those different orders with their different focuses are happening, one of the orders that appears, for example, is an order that decides they're going to make hospitals for pilgrims trying to get to Jerusalem and back. And they build hospitals, which include also like places to stay, in addition to recover from wounds and things like that. And so those guys become the hospitalers, and part of what they have to do is defend the hospitals and defend the pilgrims, because it's still very dangerous to make these trips. And so there becomes a modification of the Benedictine monastic rule of law for people who are knights who take monastic vows and now become kind of warrior knights. And so that is in the aftermath of the First Crusade. So the Hospitallers are one of those. Another one is the Templars. And so the Templars, they're so-called, they're doing about the same kind of thing, but they're so-called because they own the temple, like I say, in Jerusalem. And so they don't have the same special job of providing, like hospital care, but the Templars are also charged with defending the Crusader kingdoms. And so what ends up happening is all of the different Crusader states, the kings of Jerusalem, the counts of Tripoli, the princes of Antioch, the counts of Edessa, they give lands and castles to the Templars and the Hospitallers and the other military orders because those guys are stronger defenders. So one of the problems with a Crusader state is most of the people, they go on the crusade or a pilgrimage, they do their fighting and things like that, and then they go home. And the Crusader state is still there, and they need people because their neighbors are still there and they still have armies, right? But the beauty of having a military order like the Templars and the Hospitallers is those guys stay. You give them their kind of castle monastery thing, and then suddenly they're there and they're on the border and they're defending against the Emir of Damascus for the rest of time. And then they also are popular, and they start making houses all around Europe where people give donations and things like that, and they become rich that way. And so the Templars end up having a lot of conspiracy theories and myths around them that are all nonsense and false. But essentially, at a certain point, they become very rich because the other thing that they get involved in is banking. And so, because in the same way, when you're going on this pilgrimage, it's very dangerous to take all your money with you that you're going to need. You can give a bunch of money to a bank that the Templars have in London, get on the boat and go to Jerusalem, and you have the paper that says that you gave the Templars the money in London, and now you can have money in Jerusalem. And so that allows them to become very, very rich. Nitsky 89 asks, why did the call for the crusade cause many Jewish pogroms? What I've read, there was a direct correlation between the call to free the Holy Land from the infidels and the pogroms of Jews in Europe. You're exactly right. So there's a couple reasons. In the first place, one of the things that's happening with the revival of the Latin West is now, as opposed to when the West was collapsing and there wasn't a strong identity, there is now a much stronger, let's say, French Christian identity or Italian Christian identity, the identity especially of your local place, so Angevin or Norman. And so when you have a stronger identity, you also accomplish that through border maintenance, and you do that by identifying people who aren't what you are as the other, and you build yourself and your group up by tearing that other group down. And so whereas prior to this stronger identity, there had been a much more easy intermixing between Jews and Christians in Western Europe, which was what was the church wanted and what the different Western kings wanted. Now, especially in the outpouring of popular fervor, so there's all these local people, peasants and other people who get all worked up and want to go to Jerusalem and take it back from the Turks. Well, it's really hard if it's hard for a rich Duke of Normandy to get all the way to Jerusalem, much less for you, a regular peasant person that has never gone more than 2 villages away. And so you can't get to the Muslims, but you know where the Jews are. They're just a village over, and you can go down and attack them. And so unfortunately, that's the other reason why it leads directly to pogroms, right? And so popular massacres happen because people who get all mixed up in this fervor go and attack local people who are different from them, the Jewish communities nearby. Michelle Luz asks, can you comment on the necessity of violence for the Crusades? With respect to the excommunication of Frederick II, who got back political control of Jerusalem by diplomacy. So you don't always have to have violence. In this first case, so as of the First Crusade, there is no way that any Christian was getting back Jerusalem through diplomacy. I mean, nobody would have believed that they could have taken it, right? And so there was no way that the Seljuks or the Fatimids are going to say, you could get political control of Jerusalem. You could get, there was diplomacy that was happening. I mentioned how when the Fatimid Caliph raised the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, when he got rid of it, diplomacy happened afterwards, and his successor, his son and successor, had diplomacy with the Byzantine emperor who rebuilt the church, right? And so there was diplomacy happening where you could build a whole church in a holy city, and they would let all of the pilgrims come and go, and and there was a system for it. They would not have given away political control as of the First Crusade, because they wouldn't. There's nothing causing them to. They're, if anything, they're in the ascendance. They've just taken over Anatolia. But as you mentioned, so I was talking about how the Normans had taken over Sicily, and they founded a kingdom in southern Italy and Sicily. And so when that dynasty died out and intermarried, the last daughter of that dynasty, Constance, married the son of the son of Frederick Barbarossa, a Crusader emperor, and their child is Frederick. So that's Frederick I. Their child, Frederick II, ends up being king of the Norman Kingdom of Sicily and Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick II, the wonder of the world. And Frederick II, who had been raised in this multicultural court in Palermo, Sicily, and so probably knew Arabic, Greek, Latin, German, French, so he was an accomplished scholar in his own right. He was able to, in his correspondence with the leader of Egypt, he was able to diplomatically get control of Jerusalem back. So the Crusaders had lost Jerusalem, and they had not been able to take it back. So, Richard the Lionhearted might have been a great crusader, but he wasn't able to get it back from Saladin. He was able to reconstitute the Crusader states on the coast. But Frederick II, like you say, without a military crusade, was able to get his ally in Egypt to give it up for a couple decades, again, politically. So in that case, in that sense, it wasn't necessary at the time. Although that didn't make a lot of people happy. They wanted to get it back fully, and even in Frederick's part of the deal was he couldn't defend it, right? So he couldn't build its walls back or anything like that. So Michelangelo says, if the Crusades had never happened, do you think Constantinople would have survived for a long time, or was it going to fall anyway for other reasons? So the Byzantine Empire had a real, almost didn't survive earlier than the Crusades. There was a very close call when, what's his name? Robert Guiscard, the Duke of Apulia, the Norman leader of southern Italy, invaded and came pretty close to conquering it. He died unexpectedly, and that saved it. I think that there was every possibility that so there's a major ascendance that is happening where commercially the Byzantines lost any capacity to run their empire when they gave over all the competition that took place with the Genoese and the Venetians. They took over all kind of the wealth of all shipping and everything like that, and then there was just a military threat from Christians in the Mediterranean, from southern Italy, or from ultimately it's going to be from Hungary. So no, it would not have survived, because ultimately either the Turks would have gotten it, or or people in the Balkans, the Bulgarians, or maybe the Serbs, or the Normans, or the Venetians. They were all going to go for it. So unfortunately, the empire had lots of structures that had continuity back from the Roman Empire, and which made it less viable in the new medieval circumstances. Leandro asks, can we look at the RLDS, the Community of Christ mission, to Palestine as a 19th century crusade using 19th century evangelizing, I think it's 19th century evangelizing models. So, anyway, it's what happens is, so we have an interesting history in this church where when this church was organized in the 1830s, we were a very strong millennialists. We believed in the end of the world was going to come in a very literal way very soon. And one of the things that we thought about a lot was the idea that in order for the end of the world to happen, this is the way a lot of evangelicals today think, that Jewish people are going to have to regather to Palestine in order to bring about the end of the world. And so in the 1830s, one of our apostles got sent to the Ottoman Empire, to Palestine, to dedicate the land for the gathering of Israel. Then we had a later group within our movement decide that they needed to go back and help, and so in Maine, an entire couple congregations of what eventually became Community of Christ, they build a bunch of prefabricated houses that would be great to live in if you lived in Maine. And they brought a bunch of seeds that'd be great if you're a farmer in Maine and things like that. And they put them on a boat and they went to the Ottoman Empire. They went to Jaffa, to what becomes Tel Aviv. And they create the Jaffa colony where they put the prefabricated houses there, which are no good for the Middle East to live in. They try to farm, which they don't know how to use, American-style farming in this kind of land that they find, and so they really struggle and don't have a real successful colony. Although they're trying to bring about essentially the idea that would later become Zionism. This is before Zionism, and Mark Twain actually comes upon these guys and finds them to be, he thinks. He doesn't think very highly of them. He thinks they're quite deluded and have religious kooks who have gone and done this thing where they've thrown their whole lives into this thing that they didn't understand very well. And so he wrote a book about it called Innocents Abroad, which is to say people who don't know any better who have moved to the other side of the world for religious reasons. So I wouldn't say it's a crusade at all, because for one thing, it's not armed. It was a peaceful idea. It was religiously inspired like the Crusades. It maybe was ill-conceived, but that's why that, anyway, but that's an interesting part of our history, how that happened. And I did have a rabbi come, I think a conservative rabbi come at some point, who came to the Toronto congregation here and said, is this the RLDS church? Is this, and he wanted to thank me for that part, because he knows of our church's history in the idea of that gathering, which I was surprised that anybody knew about that. But anyway, we're not necessarily, we have reevaluated our ideas certainly about a literal second coming, and also what is necessary for that. And so I'm not endorsing what past members of the church did, but I understand why they had that fervor and why they did that. So we have some more supporters who I want to thank. So Soaring Bum and M, thank you so much. Wow. Gary Talbot, Philosophy, thanks all of you. John Cox says, did the Crusades ever really end? Well, I think so. So I think that the Crusades and what they were really doing and what they were really about, the enthusiasm died down after just repeated failure after failure after failure. And so at a certain point, after, for example, the fall of Constantinople, when the Ottoman Empire was established, there was some last attempts to do crusades against the Turks in Europe. But after those failures, crusading as an ideal was kind of beat out of Christendom, out of Western Christians. And so it wasn't really even the model anymore when the age of imperialism happens. And so I'm always a little surprised how, I think, dead the idea was that when the British actually, march in and take control of Mandate, Palestine, and take, kick the Ottomans out and so on, that they really have it as their model, British imperialism and all of their colonies that they have all around the world, almost, without even seeing this as any kind of heir or legacy to the Crusades. And in fact, it seems like there's less memory of it and less than I would expect anybody to have. But it seems like that was already, like a past and long in the rearview mirror by the time that happened. So please continue to send your questions. We're going to have, like I say, a whole session of that on January 30th, where I'm going to read comments and questions from across the different lectures. Don't forget to like and share this video, and also to subscribe to our channel. And again, I want to thank everybody who donated, and if you are able, we appreciate your donations at centerplace.ca/donate. And next week, we're going to go back and look again in depth at the Book of Enoch.